What's going on, everybody? Got a special show tonight. We actually have two shows on the Shroud that we're doing tonight and Thursday night. Um, I saw a segment with that Barrie was on with Glenn Beck a couple of weeks ago, and it seemed really interesting to me. And I figured, let me take a crack, shoot Barrie an email. You never know, maybe he'll be free and available. And it turned out he was available, so we wound up being able to set this up. For anybody that doesn't know, Barrie Schwortz was the photographer for the STURP project, which was the Shroud of Turin research project. What year was that, Barrie?
1978.
1978. So I just wanted to get I wanted to get an idea of how you were chosen for the project. And then some of the clip that I heard on Glenn Beck just about the carbon dating, there were some issues. So if you can, actually, real quick, everybody, please hit like, subscribe. And then after Barrie leaves, Rob and I are going to do a little thing on locals afterward. And we're going to talk about a couple of things that are in the news. So if you guys haven't yet, go subscribe to our locals. The show is free. There's certain things we like to do over there instead of on YouTube. So, but Barrie, how did you get chosen to be part of this project?
Well, back in the 70s, I operated a commercial photographic studio in Santa Barbara, California. And one of the local companies was a contractor to Los Alamos National Laboratories. And they were an imaging company. And they contacted and contracted me to be an imaging consultant, a photographic consultant on a project for Los Alamos National Labs. And it was all about atomic bombs and mushroom clouds. And so I can't really tell you much more about it. It was classified. Well, basically, they had very fancy computers back in the 70s, the Cray computer, a big water-cooled monster. And they were able to get new information out of old unclassified above-ground atomic explosion motion picture film, 35 millimeter film. So in their Cray computer, they were able to do things like detect the thermal gradients within a mushroom cloud, the different temperature layers. So they needed to image that. And in those days, there wasn't a print screen button like we have today. When you wanted something off the screen, you set up a camera and you photographed the screen. And because I didn't have a high enough clearance to go in the room with the computer, the gentleman from the company that contracted me, he had to do it by proxy. So I gave him the camera, the film, the exposures, the lenses, the filtration. He would go and shoot it and bring it back. I would process the film. Then we'd evaluate it. And if he got it right, we could move forward. And if he didn't, the next week he'd go back and shoot it again. And we spent 7 months doing that project. And what I didn't know at the time was because he was an imaging scientist working at Los Alamos, he had bumped into Dr. John Jackson and Dr. Eric Jumper, two Air Force Academy scientists who ultimately founded the STURP team, and they were interested in imaging. So they hooked up with Don Devan, that's this guy's name. And so I did this 7-month project, and it was over. And, when you're self-employed and the phone rings, you're hoping it's the next job. Mm-hmm. And Don Devan called me shortly after we finished. So I thought, another project. And he said, well, not exactly. He said, what do you know about the Shroud of Turin? And I laughed and I said, but Don, I'm Jewish.
Had you heard of it from that point, though?
I'd heard of it. I didn't know anything about it. Okay. Thought it was some kind of a fake, of course. Yeah. And I laughed because I said, but Don, I'm Jewish. And Don laughed and he said, so am I. Remember, he was one of the other Jewish guys on the team.
Okay.
So he assured me that this wasn't going to be a religious thing or a theological thing because I'm not qualified for that. And assured me that this was strictly about the image on that piece of cloth. We weren't trying to prove it was Jesus. We weren't trying to prove the resurrection. The whole purpose of our examination of the Shroud in 1978 was basically to determine how the image was formed. Was it a painting, scorch, photographically made image, a rubbing? These were all theories that had been proposed. So when he asked me to join the team, my initial response was, no, I don't want to do that. But then he had said to me in more technical terms that they had taken a Shroud photograph and they input it to a device at Sandia Labs, which is a sister laboratory to Los Alamos and also a weapons laboratory. And the X-ray expert over there had gotten this instrument called a VP8 image analyzer, which he wanted to use to see if he could get more information out of the X-rays he was creating. And the way this instrument worked is you input an image with a black and white camera, and it showed up on a green screen display. And so when they did that with a normal photograph, you got a distorted jumbled mass of shapes, but nothing coherent.
Yeah.
They put the shroud image in there, and they got the natural relief of a human form. So that immediately told me that there had to be some interaction between the cloth and a human body to create that. We didn't know the mechanism.
So that basically it looked like a 3-dimensional image, correct?
What you saw was the natural relief of a human form. You call it 3D. It wasn't technically 3D because it wasn't 360 degrees, but it was the natural shape and of a human form, which a normal photograph doesn't encode that information. Yeah. I mean, I can imply in a photograph, I can imply depth and texture by using highlights and shadows, but we're not recording any depth information the way the image on the shroud does. And we know that the image formation mechanism of the shroud, and this has been published in the peer-reviewed literature, proven scientifically, that the image formation mechanism on the shroud worked at a distance of up to about 4 centimeters. But as the distance increased between the cloth and the body, the image grew more faint until it got to about 4 centimeters where it reached extinction. Consequently, it encoded depth information or topographic information, and the VP8 reveals that. And of course, today, modern computers with the right piece of software, and you see the same effect from the shroud image, that data is there, and we've demonstrated that using at least 3-4 different imaging methods to show that spatial information is actually encoded into the shroud's image density. The lights and darks of the image reflect that distance correlation. So that's what really got my interest. That and the fact that I was thinking, and I'm being candid now, free trip to Italy.
And Rome on top of that, right? Like you get to go to Rome, and
I'd never been to Europe, and I thought, well, I mean, we'll get there.
How old are you in 1978?
32.
32. You're a young 32-year-old photographer, and you get this opportunity. How do I wonder how they got permission from the church to examine this thing?
They didn't. The church had nothing to do with our permission.
Because what was it? Yeah, wait, how did they get permission from, who did they ask, I guess?
The legal owner of the shroud in 1978 was King Umberto II of the Savoy family. They'd owned it for over 500 years.
Wow.
Okay. And so when King Umberto, we were working with a group out of Esopus, New York, not too far from you guys, the Holy Shroud Guild. And that was 4 Catholic priests promoting the shroud in the United States. One of those priests, Father Peter Rinaldi, was from Turin originally. He was Turinese. And he ultimately was close friends with King Umberto. And consequently, he took our very formal test plan, which, by the way, is available on shroud.com. You can see the actual document that was submitted to the king that detailed our proposal of what we wanted to do down to 5-minute increments, almost 70 pages. He took that to the king evaluated it, and he gave us permission to examine the shroud. Well, the people in Turin were the custodians of the shroud and had been for centuries, over a couple of centuries, since 1584. So it had been in Turin for 400 years when we saw it in 78. And so the custodians of the shroud were not thrilled that all of a sudden a bunch of American guys from big name laboratories are showing up to do something they've never been given permission to do. And they're right there in Turin and in control of the shroud. Yeah. And so there's still resentment amongst a few of those guys to this day that we were given permission, but the church had nothing to do with it. Now, that all changed in 1983. King Umberto passed away, and he left in his will, unlike his predecessors over the centuries, instead of leaving it to his son, which is what all the predecessors had done. He decided that no, that's not the best idea, but he didn't want to leave it to the church as an institution because then he knew it would take 130 cardinals to have to vote on it.
Yeah.
And we know that that can be a real problem. I think there was a period of time for 7 years there wasn't a pope because they couldn't make the decision properly. So the king decided to leave it to one person, the living pope. And so in 1985, after the probate of the will, the shroud became the legal property of Pope John Paul II, who was the pope at that time. And of course, upon his passing, the ownership of the shroud passed to the next pope, which was Francis.
Benedict the 16th, and now Francis.
And then to Francis. So he's the legal owner of the shroud today. And that's why nothing's been done since 1978, because I don't expect that the church is going to rush to give permission for any further testing.
That's kind of sad because I think that a lot more can be found out. Okay, so now you guys are packing up to go to Italy. You decide that you're going to go on this trip. And how many scientists actually worked on the project?
Well, there were 33 or 34 of us on the team, formally as team members, but not all of us were required to be in Turin to collect the data. Some of the guys on the team were there once the data was collected to analyze and evaluate it. And of course, we were there 19 days, which meant airline tickets for all these people, hotel rooms for 19 days for each person.
Yeah.
So the expense of coming over there, we only took the guys over there that were critical for collecting the data. Mm-hmm. Once we finished over the 5 days and nights and we came back, then we spent the next 3 years reducing the data and evaluating it, analyzing it, drawing conclusions, writing that into papers and submitting that to the finest peer-reviewed scientific journals that existed at the time. And our work formed the foundation, if you will, of peer-reviewed science about the Shroud of Turin.
Wow. So now from all the data you guys collected, how long did you guys actually get to work on the Shroud for? It was like a
5 days and nights.
5 days and nights.
Yeah, we never stopped, worked around the clock.
Oh, wow. I thought you guys had more
time.
And
remember, it's a pretty big piece of cloth, 14 and a half feet in length. So at any given time, if somebody was working at one end of the shroud, say on the ventral frontal image, somebody else was doing something else on the dorsal half of the shroud with the dorsal image, so that we were constantly doing something on that cloth. It never sat idle.
Yeah. Is there any other image that when you take a photo of it, but just like Secondo Pia took, I think it was in the early 1900s, he took a picture
1898.
1898, he takes a picture of this thing, and when he produces the negative comes out as a positive. Is there anything else that does that on the planet?
Well,
I guess you could purposely make something like that, right?
Well, yeah, photographic film does that, of course, but there's no silver salts on the shroud proving it wasn't made photographically, so that didn't occur. But yeah, what's on the shroud effectively has the lights and darks inverted, much like a photographic negative. Now, of course, we live in the 21st century, and it's getting more and more difficult to explain to people what a photographic negative is.
Yeah, because everything's digital.
It's all digital now. And I mean, this is true story. I had a 10-year-old kid in Canada ask me if film was a USB device.
Yeah, it's because if you take a photo of the shroud now, you take it with your phone, you don't get it's not the same thing as taking film into a dark room and developing it. We don't do that anymore. Correct. So
that's right. Well, there's a few people still doing that. Mostly the fine art photographers are still using paper-based printing materials and photographic films. But what used to be available, Kodak used to have just a vast array of films for all different purposes, scientific purposes, high resolution, low grain. There was just a vast array of color and black and white films that Kodak could make available. Most of those films aren't made anymore. So there are still a few films left that are being made, but on a very small scale compared to what it used. I mean, there used to be a yellow Kodak sign hanging over every shop on every street corner in the world.
Everybody used to get film developed all the time.
Yeah,
So
and I was in Jerusalem in 2013. We were in the old city and the old town, and I noticed the shop had a Kodak sign hanging over it. I took a picture of the Kodak sign because I recognized at that moment, it was already, and I was with a digital camera by then.
yeah, the irony.
So I knew that the Kodak sign was going to disappear, and now you don't see them much anymore, except on old storefronts, maybe in places, kind of out in the country, like where I live.
Where they haven't taken them down yet.
Where they just haven't taken them down, right?
So, okay, so now what's the first thing that stands out to you when you finally get the chance to observe this? Now, you have all the scientists there. What's the first thing that somebody says, whoa, this is
look, we photographers, especially in the old analog days, always carried with us a high-powered magnifying glass, whether it be a loop like this, or I have a 10x on my Swiss Army knife.
My grandfather used to carry one, and anytime somebody would come in the house with jewelry, he'd take the jewelry and he'd look at the thing. Let me see, is that a fake? I want to see.
So when we got into the room and the shroud was eventually brought to us, first thing I did was pulled out the loop, and I went over to where the image area was, because even though I'm not a textile expert or anything, I can easily identify paint, pigment, binder that would hold paint and pigment. And I took my 10x magnifier over to the image portion of the cloth, and I was looking for paint or pigment to see, can I see anything added here? And there was nothing. As a matter of fact, when you get close to the shroud, you realize that what appears to be darker portions of the image they're all the same monochromatic yellow color. The thing that makes it look darker in any given area is the concentration of those yellowed fibers in that area. But all the yellowed fibers are the same yellow. So there's no lighter or darker. And now if you look at a halftone in a magazine and put your 10x loop on the halftone, you'll see it's comprised of little dots.
Right.
It's what a halftone is. And those little dots are fewer and further between in lighter areas, and more heavily concentrated in darker areas. And so there's a similarity in the way the shroud image is formed, in that it's the concentration of these yellowed fibers that gives the impression of a darker versus a lighter area.
Yeah.
And it's being linen, it's not even the entire thread, right? It's
absolutely.
It's just one or two fibers on the top of it.
A couple of microns on the top surface of the fibers only.
So if you went there with a razor and shaved it, you'd lose the image.
Quite possibly. It would be one heck of a razor. But yeah, so that the image on the cloth is a surface phenomena. It did not penetrate into the cloth the way, look, if you take paint or pigment, whether it's oil-based, water-based, doesn't really matter. It's going to soak into the cloth via capillarity, capillary action. And there are water stains and blood stains on the shroud that absolutely soaked into the cloth based on capillarity. And you can see where they spread out. The water stains, where many of them came from a fire in 1532 that caused all the damage on the cloth. And they dumped some water on it, and that water then spread out. And at the periphery of those water stains, you can still see them visibly on the shroud. And there was enough material collected as the water spread out at the periphery for those water stains to show up on the x-rays of the shroud. The image didn't show up, but the water stains did, and the blood stains did, because what's in our blood? Iron.
Yeah.
And so that showed up, but the image does not, and the image did not penetrate. So there was nothing added to the cloth to create that image. Simple as that.
What kind of tests were performed on it besides? I would imagine it was X-rayed and infrared photography, right? Things like
infrared photography, ultraviolet fluorescence, and reflectance photography, white light, natural light photography, transmitted light photography. I did those photographs with light passing through the shroud, which demonstrates clearly what we just finished talking about. that you can see the water stains, you can see the blood stains, you can see the scorches and the patches and the burn holes. No image is visible with transmitted light because it didn't penetrate into the cloth. Nothing was added to make that image. So it's literally on the surface. And that's the first solid evidence that we could show that proves that there was nothing added to the cloth to create this image.
Yeah. So we still to this day have no idea how the image itself was made, right?
That's basically correct. That's the only correct answer because, there's a lot of theories. Some people say, well, it was the resurrection that did it. Maybe it was, but we can never prove that scientifically.
Yeah. I saw an interesting clip from it was a particle physicist that was observing some things, and that one of the things she observed is that if a linen shroud was wrapped around a body and laid on a stone, you would expect to see like the image distorted from the body pressing on the stone, right?
Yes. If the image on the shroud were strictly a contact image, that would be 100% correct.
Yeah.
We know the image worked at a collimated distance of up to about 4 centimeters. So direct contact was not how that image was formed. There was some contact, but there was portions of that image. For example, if I lay down on my back, cross my hands over my torso, I'm lifting the cloth away from my body where my hands are on top of each other. And if you look at the shroud, there's a lighter image area surrounding the hands where the distance between cloth and body increased to a point where it just almost reached extinction. So because of the fact that the image formation mechanism was not just a direct contact mechanism, we don't have that distortion.
Yeah, she was saying, like, she was speaking hypothetically, but she said it's almost as if there was no gravity inside the empty tomb, if that's what it is. But it's because the cloth itself is pulled taut, and the image is made perfect from top to bottom, and there's no distortion from the body resting on a stone or anything.
Let me qualify that. There is some distortion in the image. It's just not the wraparound distortion that would be expected if it were strictly by contact only.
Right.
And we've had people make contact only wraparound distorted images where their face is about this wide.
Yeah.
Because
you're wrapping it around.
You
but this worked in a vertical manner. This worked strictly in a vertical collimated manner. So to me, that pretty much eliminates light. That eliminates radiation. And I'm still of the belief that we don't have enough data to exclude a natural explanation. And I think the possibility of a chemical reaction may well be the explanation for the image, but we don't have enough data to stand on that and say that's fact.
Yeah, you have to understand. Okay, so the reason I was excited to get you on is because I've been watching you on documentaries for years, right? So I kind of was going through life not even paying attention to my faith whatsoever, and then it was like on an Easter when I was maybe 28 that I went to church just because it was Easter, and when I heard a sermon there, and I come home and I'm like, what do I really believe? Did Jesus really die? I was questioning the resurrection, and I went inside and I turned on my TV, and on Netflix in my previously watched, which I hadn't watched it, so it was very strange. In my previously watched segment, there was a documentary on the Shroud of Turin, and I watched this documentary with you in it, and it was very strange because I go into the documentary as a skeptic, and I came out of it that was it. It was like I completely believed it.
I say this frequently, so
yeah, I know.
If you've heard this before, I'm sorry. Science must stay within the measurable and the observable.
Mm-hmm.
Faith has no boundaries. So you can accept on faith that the resurrection made this image, and there's no way that science can challenge that.
Yeah.
But there's no way science can support that either.
Yeah. Because I know a lot of people press you on, well, if you believe this is really the burial cloth of Jesus, how come you haven't converted? But I think that that's a personal thing, and it's a
well. And look, the answer to that, since you brought it up, is that I can serve God by being exactly who I am.
Yeah. It's just I imagine you're pretty much going on everybody that probably wants to interview is coming at it from a Christian perspective. So I imagine you have to go through this
look,
quite
the
often.
whole concept of resurrection, people say, oh, you're just afraid of resurrection. Well, where does the concept of resurrection come from? The Old Testament.
Yeah.
It's a Jewish concept. It's out of the prophecies. So I'm not anti-resurrection as some people have painted me. I'm just saying that I was a member of the only scientific team ever to be given permission to do an in-depth study of the Shroud. I'm obligated to stay within that realm to preserve the work of my fellow team members, most of whom have died now, and to stick to the science, which is what brought me on board in the first place. When it comes to faith, that's a personal choice. Even Jesus said the kingdom of God is within us. Yeah. So the answer to faith isn't on a piece of cloth, but it's in the eyes and hearts of those standing in front of it.
Yeah, I think it almost brings an air of credibility to what you're saying too, because you're not coming at it from a religious aspect, right? You're saying, no, look, I'm telling you from a scientific aspect. I'm not even a person of faith. This cloth.
Well, I'm not a person of that faith.
Correct. Yeah. So, but you believe that you still do believe that this is the burial cloth of Jesus Christ, though, right?
Well, look, and again, I'm repeating myself. I'm sorry for that if you've heard this before, but you don't need to be a Christian to accept the historicity of Jesus of Nazareth. Yeah. And you don't need to believe in miracles to accept that we might have an artifact left over of this man whose life was so important, even more powerful today than when he was walking on this planet.
Yeah.
And so of anybody in the whole known universe, in all of recorded history, having an artifact of this man, this is why the skeptics hate this, because this challenges their worldview pretty dramatically.
Yeah.
And I can understand that. And, when people say to me, well, how come you're not a Christian anymore? I go, well, hey, wait a minute. He's one of our boys.
He was Jewish.
And what has frustrated me in recent years, especially, is anti-Semitism coming from supposed Christians that worship a Jewish man.
Yeah.
Explain that one to me. I don't understand that.
Yeah.
Ignorance has no excuse,
Yeah, it's strange, people, what are you gonna do? But
not much.
So I would say so you guys take all this information that you gather from the project. How long does it take to disseminate all of it before you guys actually start writing conclusions and submitting things to peer review journals?
3 years.
3 years of going over the data.
And we finished the examination in October of 78 and started publishing our papers and had our final meeting and published our work in 1981, 3 years later. So we spent not every minute of that 3 years did every person work on his paper, but over a period of 3 years, we reduced the data, analyzed it, draw conclusions based on the data that we had, and then wrote the papers and submitted those for publication in peer-reviewed journals. In those days, though, peer-reviewed journals weren't accessible to the average person unless you had access to a university research library.
Yeah.
The average person didn't have access to that. So when I built Shroud.com, the purpose there was to give everybody access to the same science that convinced me, a non-Christian, that this is very much likely to be an artifact of the historic Jesus of Nazareth. You don't need to be a Christian to make that sort of set of steps in belief. And whether or not he was the prophesied Messiah isn't something science can answer anyway. That's a test of faith. That's not a test for science.
So what were there anything were there like any things that you discovered that people don't actually discover? I mean, I've seen some weird things that people said, like when you study the eyes, you could see the images of the coins that they would put over their eye. Like, does any of that come through in any of the photography, or is that kind of just stuff that people caught afterward? And
I'm going to quote the lead chemist who was on our team, Ray Rogers from Los Alamos National Laboratories, who frequently reminded me that I think I see is not a scientific statement.
Yeah. Okay. So now, how much later after you guys finish everything does the carbon dating actually take place? It's not during this time, right? It comes later on.
10 years later.
10 years later.
Yeah, we finished and published our work by 81, and the carbon dating was done in 1988.
Who did the carbon dating?
Carbon dating was done by 3 different laboratories: Zurich, Oxford, and Arizona here in the U.S.
Now, all 3 sites tested the same area, though, right? It wasn't taken from different areas on the shroud.
That's right. Not only that, they didn't take a control sample from anywhere else on their cloth. And the strip that was cut, so let's back up and give the viewer an opportunity here. They cut a strip from one edge of the cloth. They cut that strip in half, put half aside as a reserve sample, took the remaining half of the strip, divided it into thirds by weight, and delivered that to the 3 laboratories. When the labs tested their samples, there was a range of dates. The sample was inhomogeneous. What it means is they got a different date here than they got from here and here and here and here. So there was no place on that strip that was cut that you can use as a credible reference for anywhere else on that cloth.
Yeah.
Now,
did
one laboratory have just one piece from part of that strip and another laboratory, like
that they took that second half of the strip and then divided that in thirds.
Okay,
and
so
each laboratory got a third of that portion of the strip.
So there could have been differences not only in the part of the strip, but in the actual accuracy of the laboratory itself.
Well, here's the thing. It took 27 years in the Freedom of Information Act to finally get the British Museum, which acted as the overseer of the 3 labs. It took 27 years, and a French researcher going to England and using the Freedom of Information Act to force the British Museum to release the raw data from the 3 laboratories.
Oh, really?
Yeah, now that's pretty unusual because usually you release the raw data pretty much when you publish your work, and you're done. After finally getting our hands on the raw data, we can understand why they blocked us for 27 years and not wanting us to see it, because what we found was they were tossing away a lot of their readings, that they were taking measurements and they didn't like the measurement, so they discarded it. They called that an outlier. Trouble is, there were a lot of outliers. Had they kept any of those outliers, they could have never reached the 95% certainty that they claimed for their test.
Oh, wow.
The other thing they did was, because there wasn't a solid dated chunk in that strip, but a kind of a range of dates going from older to younger along that strip, there was nowhere there that could give us a viable date for anywhere else on that cloth.
Yeah.
And it turns out that what they did was, so they took all their individual readings and they averaged them together. Well, that's cooking the data, folks. That's definitely not how you do it. And it took us 27 years before we finally got our hands on that raw data. And there's now 5 peer-reviewed scientific journal articles challenging that radiocarbon date. And it only took 30 years. And now even the media is finally reporting it a little more accurately by saying, well, they radiocarbon dated it in 1988, but new evidence shows that the sample they used wasn't valid. 30 years later, it took before we get the truth of the matter, in that the sample was not valid for the radiocarbon dating. Now, if they had taken one sample from anywhere else on that cloth as a control sample, then they might have turned out a better result, perhaps, but they didn't do that.
Yeah.
Now, why they didn't do that isn't up to the 3 laboratories. In all fairness to the 3 labs, they didn't cut the samples. The samples were cut and delivered to them. Okay, so they got what they got, and that's what they tested. And it's a shame, because the media headlines immediately were Shroud is a fake, and that was the end of it.
And that story stuck around for a very long time. Now, you were saying
30 years.
You were saying also that the samples they took weren't just linen; there was actually cotton mixed in with those.
Well, there was
samples,
cotton interwoven with it, and you guys might know about this, that there is a Jewish law called mixing of the kinds.
Yeah,
I see Rob is nodding his head.
Yeah.
Yeah, a burial shroud for someone of very high stature, like Joseph Arimathea, who had it and provided it, who was a wealthy man. We don't know much else about him. but a burial cloth of such high stature must be of pure linen with no cotton or wool interwoven with it.
Mhm.
And yet, when we didn't find cotton anywhere else on the shroud, but in that corner where they cut that strip, there was cotton spliced in with the linen.
So this was a section that was 99% was repaired from a damaged section. I mean, you got to
And
realize
newer material had been added, thus
Yeah.
skewing the date much to a
Mhm.
more modern range.
Yeah, so now if they're averaging it out and you're getting something that says it could be 2000, but then you got this thing from 700 years ago that was, repaired in this section. There's some really great documentaries where they actually go through the evidence and show how even the pattern of the shroud itself, there's artistic renderings of it from way before
Going back to
any-
the 4th century.
Yeah, so if you have these artistic renderings with that pattern that's on the shroud through these artistic renderings from the 4th century, how could that predate any of the tests? They've also never been able to recreate this thing in any meaningful way. They've gotten little glimpses of like, oh well, by exposing it under this, you could get, but
Yeah, but
that would also include the foresight of photography coming in the future.
no one, and I've looked at every attempt to duplicate the shroud in the last 45 years. Many of the people, I provided a high quality shroud photograph for them to work from, and they still couldn't come close to matching what's on the shroud. You can't make something that just looks like the shroud. You have to make something with the same chemistry and physics that we've documented is on that cloth.
Yeah.
And that's why when I hear skeptics say, oh, it's still just a painting, there's no paint on the cloth.
Yeah.
You can't claim it's a painting if there's no paint. We've proven it's not a painting. And
Yeah.
you don't hear me using the word proven very often, but that's one thing we've proven. It's not a painting. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's also not just that it's not a painting, it also has the remarkable similarities to the description of the crucifixion in John's gospel compared
Forensically accurate blood stains and crucifixion wounds. And that's not my opinion. That's the opinion of the forensic experts who've studied the shroud, Dr. Fred Zuggaby, Dr. Robert Buckland. Dr. Buckland was on our team.
Mhm.
And you may not have heard of Dr. Robert Buckland, but you remember the Quincy television program?
Oh yeah, Quincy, yeah.
Well, Dr. Buckland was the basis for that character.
Oh really?
And was a consultant to the producers. And he
Oh,
was
that's
on
funny.
our team. So we were pretty well qualified. We didn't
Yeah.
have a bunch of flakes on our team. And so Buckland and Zuggaby spent over 50 years. He was the matter of fact, he's from your neck of the woods, but Fred Zuggaby was the coroner and medical examiner of Rockland County, just up north.
Oh wow. Yeah.
You know where
Yeah.
that is.
Yeah.
As Zuggaby used to tell me, may he rest in peace, he says, yeah, Rockland County, where the mob always buries the bodies. That was Fred's sense of humor,
Oh
But
man.
he had to deal with a lot of bodies that they dug up.
He was the medical examiner up there, I'd imagine.
Yeah, he was for 35 years. They've renamed the medical examiner building the Zuggaby building. So, I mean, he was highly esteemed and a very high quality. And he spent over 50 years studying the effects of crucifixion and the shroud on the human body. So, look, the skeptics like to say, well, the bloodstains look fake. Well, unless you're a qualified bloodstain analyst, you're not qualified to have that opinion.
Yeah. Rob, I know I saw a bunch of questions you highlighted. You want to go through some of those questions? I know somebody asked if they found DNA in the. Did they find any DNA?
That was one. Was DNA found on the shroud?
Oh, listen, we weren't looking for DNA. We were
Not
there
in
to study
78.
in 78, we didn't know from DNA. But here's the problem. My DNA is on the shroud.
Yeah.
We didn't learn till 2008 that we're shedding epithelial cells constantly. And if I leaned over the shroud, I left my DNA on it.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody who's touched the shroud has left their DNA on it. Everybody who's repaired the shroud or worked on the shroud or even prayed over the shroud has left their DNA on it. And
Yeah, anybody that's watched Forensic Files knows that, right?
yeah, we're not going to solve this one in 43 minutes. Then, to make matters worse, in 2002, they decided to do a clandestine intervention on the shroud. And for 32 days, 2 Swiss textile experts, and I'm putting experts in quotes here, handled the shroud with no gloves, no hairnet, no mask, no protective clothing. They handled literally every square inch of that cloth. They removed all the existing patches that had been sewn in by the Poor Clare sisters to repair the fire damage of 1532 and 1534. They basically handled every square inch. They steamed it to get out some of the wrinkles, which of course is not good for old linen. They scraped away the char around the burn holes and commingled that into not enough number of separated vials.
Who gave them permission for this?
Oh, wait, I'm not even done. Then they removed the backing sheet that had been sewn on in 1534 and sewed a newer, wider backing sheet onto it, making the image that much harder to see. And in all of these cases, over 32 days, day and night of handling, no gloves, no hairnet, nothing to protect the cloth from DNA. And by 2002, we knew a little bit about DNA.
Yeah.
But they didn't take that into consideration. So unfortunately, if we did a DNA analysis of the man of the shroud today, we'd find he's a Swiss woman.
Plus, they could have screwed up any future radiometric dating as well.
Well, they certainly and they vacuumed it too, so that any future pollen evidence has been destroyed or wiped away or disrupted to a point where it's no longer easy to study it. So
it's a miracle that they didn't destroy the image completely. I mean, that's crazy that they were allowed to do all that.
Well, they did it. And when they were confronted with it, when the news finally broke and they were confronted with it, they said, well, this wasn't about science. It was about conservation. Really? And science doesn't play a major role in conservation? Of course it does. So, yeah, what can I say?
Man, I never heard that. That's so...
Well, there's a page on shroud.com called Comments on the Restoration. It was written in 2002. Basically, there was this outpouring from the shroud world of shroud scholars, and we published 12 comments from 12 different scholars as to their opinions of what this intervention might mean for future science and for existing science. And if you go to shroud.com, you can read every bit of that.
Yeah, definitely go visit Barrie's website. That's how I got in touch with you, Barrie. I'm so glad that you had that up and you had a contact for him. That it was, and I was amazed that you were so free to give your time with us, man. This is really cool. We got to talk a little bit.
This is all I do anymore.
Yeah,
I'm retired from all the other stuff.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Yeah, Barrie was telling us he's got a nice little place, he's secluded up where he's living, and it's him and his cats up there now. So, Rob, is there any other questions that you wanted to get to?
Yeah, there are 2. One person here wants to know if you've done any work with Father Andrew Dalton at all.
He was one of my students at the course I teach at the Pontifical University in Rome.
Oh, wow.
And he was not Father Dalton then. He was still Brother Dalton in those days. It was about 12 years ago. He was in the first class I taught in that course in the master's program at the university there. And at the end of the first day, in between, I do 3 lectures a day, 45 minutes, 10-minute break, 45 minutes. And in between, I was talking with him. And I remember going to the dean at the end of that first day. And I said, listen, there's a young lad in my class, Andrew Dalton. I said, he's got to be the smartest guy in the room. He was brilliant. And I said, not only that, the man has a heart, and he's going to be a great priest. And some years later, of course, he was ordained. He's a legionary priest, so you got to be a brother for at least 12 years in the legion before you can be ordained. Yeah. And I think he went about 13 years before ordination. So, but he and I are great friends, and we've lectured together and in Canada and other places. And so, yes, I know Father Andrew, and he's become a great spokesman for the shroud.
Yeah. And what's the other question, Rob?
The last question we have is, we've already kind of touched on it, but as far as you know, are there any credibility to some of the the newer claimed findings, such as being buried face down, multiple
the
images.
one that you have on the screen, this is the amazing something or other. There's a video and a web page to go with it. Complete nonsense, complete misinterpretation of what's on that cloth. And look, you can't tell me there's something on the cloth if it isn't there. Okay. Yeah. And we documented what's there. Mm-hmm. And I think I said this earlier. I think I see is not a scientific statement.
Yeah.
And this guy's I think I sees are so ridiculous and that I have written a response because I get emails about this all the time. Mm-hmm. And so if the person who asked that question sends me an email asking me the same question, I'll send you the pre-written, because once I've written it clearly, I save it. And that way the next person asks me the question, I don't have to write it from scratch each time. And so if that person wants to send me the email asking the question, I'll send you what I send out to everybody else, which is this complete nonsense.
Yeah. Hey, you mentioned pollens after they vacuumed. Did they do any tests for pollens or anything when you guys went?
Well, we did tape sampling, which lifted surface debris from the cloth that included pollens. Max Fry, which is part of the Italian team, he did tape sampling as well. The problem with pollens is there's an issue with pollens that most people don't understand. Again, I'm not a palynologist. That's not my field of expertise. But I've learned this through 28 years as the editor of Shroud.com. Pollens are sealed little containers. But over time, the intine, the inside of it, which is pulp-like, like inside of a tree, that dries out. And as it dries out, the pressure differential, remember that experiment we did in high school physics where we crushed a can by changing the pressure? Well, that's what happens with pollens. And they change their shape because they get crushed over time as the intine dries out. Yeah. And the shape changes, making it much more difficult to identify the pollen itself because they don't look the way a fresh pollen would look. So unfortunately, with the intervention that was done and the fact that Max Fry, who did the tape sampling in 78 for the Italians, he was not a palynologist either. And he died before he published any of his work. So there really isn't any peer-reviewed science confirming the identification of the pollens. There have definitely been pollens found on the shroud. Yeah. Some people have identified them as to only being in Jerusalem, but there's no peer-reviewed science that we can point to that says, look, this has been examined, the data has been collected, published into an article, and reviewed by expert palynologists who are qualified to evaluate and determine if the conclusions drawn are correct. That's what peer review is all about.
I mean, the only things that can get posted are things that are proven to be like, it's not worth putting some speculative.
Lots of speculation these days.
Yeah. What was that, Rob? Mrs. Schwartz, thank you for your diligence with the shroud and coming to share your knowledge with us. Yeah. Barrie, thank you so much, man. This was really great. I've had such a fascination with the shroud ever since I came back to my faith and stuff, and it had a very big part in my conversion. So like I said, I've been watching you for 13 years now. So it's really wild to get to have a conversation with you.
Well, I assume that you're going to put this, you're going to make a permanent link to this.
Oh, yeah. I'll email it to you.
Email me the link and we'll include it in our next website update, probably in November.
Oh, excellent. Thank you so much, Barrie. We appreciate that so much. Yeah, this was great. So Barry's got to get going because he's got things to do over there anyway. Guys, we're gonna head over to locals now. So if you guys can, the locals is free. We just like to go do a little stuff for our our closer fans. So Barrie, thank you so much, man. And we hope to get you back on sometime in the future.
Well, my pleasure, you guys. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Rob, for inviting me on the program. It went very well. I'm glad it worked as well as it did. Thank you. Take good care and God bless.
Thank you so much. We'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.